Are you ready? Stand by.
Welcome to the 3 Gun Show, your source for technique, strategy, and match recon, brought to you by Armalite Rifles, LAG Tactical, and Breda Shotguns. I'm your host, Dave Hartman. This week I'm joined by Reuben Aleckson of Vortex Optics, and we discuss how to set your rifle and yourself up for long-range shooting as it relates to multi-gun events. This podcast is brought to you by LAG Tactical. I've been using LAG gear for 3 years now, and I just got an upgrade into their new for 2018 MCS mag pouches. MCS stands for Modular Carry System and is a two-piece design that fits most double-stack 9 and 40 mags and most AR mags. That means I can loan gear to someone in need on the range, even if we're shooting different guns. I've been using these pouches for many matches now, and they've been great. I like that you can choose the retention based on what is required by the stage, speed demon or locked in tight. I've been shooting the low-cut Supernova holster as well, and it has been a dream. They make it in a mid and high cut too if you're into that, but I'm digging the low cut, super fast draws, and plenty of retention when you need it. Check them out, lagtactical.com, and use code 3GS in all caps to save yourself 10% when placing an order. This podcast is also brought to you by Armalite. Through Armalite, I am able to get special pricing for listeners on their line of 3-gun rifles. They have a 13.5 and an 18-inch model, both with Armalite's patented tunable comp, Timney triggers, Luth AR stocks, and they're ready to go right out of the box. If you're more of a build-your-own rifle kind of person, I have a few of their competition handguards left in 12-inch and 15-inch sizes as well. So when you're in the market for a rifle or components to build your own, just email me, dave@3gunshow.com, and I will hook you up. Anytime you see me on the range, you can check out my rifle. I'm currently rocking the 13.5-inch Shorty 3-gun rifle with a Vortex Optics Viper PST 1-6 on it, which I'm really enjoying. The reviews are still coming in from iTunes, and I want to share a couple of those with you right now. The first one is from Justin_RMR Bullets, and Justin_RMR Bullets says, 5 stars. Great show, very informative, and a great way to learn on so many levels. I always look forward to hearing about matches that I haven't been to. I get the information I need to decide if it's worth the traveling expense. The UML episode rocked, and I hope that takes off and is wildly successful. Well, thanks, Justin. I'm glad you're digging the show and getting a lot out of it and helping you make those buying decisions. And UML does sound like it's going to be awesome, and I hope it takes off as well. The next one is from Do Work Drift Crew, and Do Work Drift Crew says, thanks for all you do, 5 stars. Crucial content in a fun and informative setting. Easily has helped me progress from a new shooter to a better shooter. Helped with getting friends into the sport as well. Do Work Drift Crew, that is great to hear, man, or woman. And totally pumped. Glad to help you along your journey in becoming a better shooter, and always great to get new people into the sport. If you want to leave a review of your own, you can do so at 3gunshow.com/iTunes, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. While you're there, take a screen capture, send it to your shooting buddies. Help spread the word about the great content you can find here at the 3-Gun Show. And for those of you who have left a review and have told a friend, thank you. Keep her going. Help me out. Help me spread the word about the 3-Gun Show. At multi-gun matches, we are constantly asked to push the limits of pistol and shotgun, frequently shooting targets well past the practical range of each firearm. When we get to the rifle stage, many shooters become nervous or lack confidence in shooting well within the effective range of the platform. In this podcast, Reuben Aleckson discusses the steps that you can take to give yourself that confidence and make sure you are prepared to shine at long-range rifle stages, including selecting the right ammunition, how to properly align your scope in various positions, and the importance of trusting your gear. Now enjoy this one with Reuben Aleckson. Reuben, welcome back to the 3-Gun Show.
Hey Dave, thanks for having me. How's it going?
Dude, it's going awesome, man. It's been a while since we've chatted on the podcast here, but we've been talking offline here about getting ready for the 3-gun season. I've already shot my first match of the year. What's the first part of your year looking like here?
Well, I was actually able to start a little earlier than I normally do, And by the way, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it. It's funny how the conversation always turns into, oh man, we should record that.
Yeah. I've had that conversation so many times with you. It's like we're talking about topics. So for people listening, like I call you for advice on, 3-gun. Let's be honest. I call you for advice on 3-gun. I call you for advice on, like, hey, how would you handle this situation, stuff like that. And then you and I just generally talk about life in general a lot of times when one of us is traveling someplace as well. And it's usually about the 38th minute in, I'm like, God, really wish I was recording this.
Yeah, it seems to be a recurring theme, so maybe we just set that up before we talk.
Yeah, exactly.
I was able to kind of get back on track. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
I was able to actually shoot the post-SHOT Show match, Pete Rensing's UML match.
Yeah.
And for somebody from a northern state with snow on the ground in January, February, we don't get a lot of 3-gun in up north. We don't need to talk about that a lot. I know that gets brought up quite a bit when talking about the Minnesota shooters and the Wisconsin shooters, but I got to start a little bit early this year, and that was a blast. I mean, we were both at that match, and man, Pete puts on a heck of a match, especially for a guy that's at SHOT Show all week talking to industry contacts and sponsors.
Yeah, man, let's talk about that for a minute. I'm glad you brought that up because we've been planning that one for like 5 or 6 months out, right? Like I remember when you first brought it up, like, hey, we're in this game for the game. Why do we just stand around for a week and then go home? Why don't we hang out with a group of people, like-minded individuals, have a good time, and remember why we're in this in the first place? And I was like, that sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah, it was a really cool dynamic shooting with a bunch of people that I would say for the most part had been either at SHOT Show most of the week or worked it or at least had visited it. And everybody was very relaxed, very laid back. Still a competitive nature, of course, because we're all competitors, and so you can't even have dinner at Applebee's without people competing. But it was fun, and I think that, yeah, we had been talking about it for a while, and I was like, we're all there. We're all in Vegas. We all, hear such good things about the matches that happen out here. And for people that normally don't get out to Pete's regular matches, to Expedition, Safariland, Surefire, it was a good way to get out at Pro Gun Club and throw some lead downrange. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I was pretty excited to do so too because that was the first match that I shot of the new UML format, and it was the Expedition format, and it was the first match that I shot that Pete's run, and the first time I met Pete in person. So there was a lot of firsts there, and it was pretty cool to do it in like a low pressure environment where it was like a club match, So
yeah,
at the end of the day, no one's going to win a Cadillac, but like you said, you're still trying to be out there and do your best.
Well, it's also fun because we shoot local matches, right? And we all have our home clubs per se. And a lot of the times the people that go to the major matches and the people that, sometimes that you squad with, they might be other, shooters at the same level as you are. And, so you don't really get to shoot club matches with the same people that you shoot majors with, I would say, unless it's a group of people like, the Michigan guys that all travel the matches together, or the Texas guys that, come up and shoot Blue Ridge every year or whatnot. But it was kind of fun to get to shoot what I would call kind of a major local, but with guys that were usually head to head with on a major competitive level.
Yeah, that's a good point. It had that relaxed club match atmosphere. It was only $40, and then it also had the benefit of some of the best shooters in the country being at the club match too. It was a really cool idea. I'm definitely gonna do it again. Like this is gonna be a tradition for me from now on because I did really find a lot of value in shooting a match after SHOT Show, even though I was tired from running around all week.
Yeah, honestly, by the time you get to Thursday and Friday of SHOT Show and your feet feel like they're gonna fall off, you're kind of hanging on by a thread. And I was like, but I got a match tomorrow, so it's all good.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what? Bonus, it caused me not to go out and celebrate the end of SHOT Show on Friday too. So we
There you go.
we did like a taco dinner. We made taco, or actually, I watched Nick Miller make tacos, and and then
So you didn't find a Dickie's barbecue to get tacos at?
now it's coming out.
Zinger.
Ah.
Zinger.
All right, so for people wondering what we're talking about here, Three Gun Nation Southwest Regional, 2017.
Last March.
Last March. Yep. Scott Green and I went to Dickie's Barbecue, and we had barbecue tacos. And Reuben has given me a hard time ever since, saying that chain tacos are good tacos.
Hey, I'm not saying it can't happen. It's just that lightning usually doesn't strike twice in the same place.
Yeah, it's funny because and you know it's weird because the Dickies in Texas, and I'll admit it sounds ridiculous, but the Dickies in Texas is completely different than it is here in Colorado. Like Colorado, we have when they say barbecue, they mean like KC barbecue. It's like sweet, sticky, that kind of stuff. But in Texas, you get like a different type of barbecue. There's a lot of smoking, a lot of rubs, things like that. And I prefer Texas barbecue. And our buddy Dylan Easley is absolutely wrong. He's from Kansas City, so he's tainted. He's absolutely wrong in this, and Texas barbecue is way better. But I will say that of chain barbecue joints, that one in Texas is probably the best I've ever been to. I did go to one here in Colorado since I've been back. And man, their brisket is like roast beef. It's pretty bad.
Yeah, we have a local Dickies in Middleton, and I have not gone to it, but there was kind of a joke going back and forth between you and me about about I'm not going to go to Texas, which is like world renowned for really good, barbecue and steaks and all that stuff, and go to a place I can just go to down the road from work.
Yeah. So. and I give you that, but if I may defend myself, because I feel like I got to defend myself. I get it, Dave.
It's different. I get it. No, it's
no.
It's not like that.
We had just a couple hours between the end of the match and the prize table, and Scott and I were starving. So we went to the closest place possible, which was in Navasota. And Navasota is a very small town, very nice town, but it doesn't have a whole lot of food options. So we did the best we could with what we had.
That's a good point, Dave. And I'm not taking anything away from Dickie's barbecue. It's actually pretty good. I'm just giving you a hard time.
Well, we'll find some better barbecue next time we're in Texas. And that's coming up soon, actually.
That is coming up soon. Nice segue, by the way.
You like that one? I'm excited for this one, dude.
That was good. So we've got the Vortex Shooter Source 3-Gun Championship coming up in about 3 weeks from now, 2 weeks from now, something like that. And that's a match that I'm so excited for. Man, I have been thinking about that match since I left the range last year.
Yeah. So this is a really great match. So for people that are hiding in the dark, there is a match recon episode on this, and I'll put it in the show notes so you can go check it out and see what it was like. But this is a match where it is all natural terrain. There's actually 20-something bays at this range, which is Triple C range in Crescent, Texas. And none of the bays are used whatsoever for the Vortex Shooter Source match, and it is completely open terrain, and it is a kick in the pants.
Yeah, not to detract from the focus of what we're talking about today, but yeah, the match has been something that Jeremy Moore, the Texan with a capital T himself, and myself and Adam Maxwell and a couple other guys have talked about for about 5 years, 6 years now. And there's like you said, there's a whole episode about the match and the inception of it and how it was all, kind of come up. But it's a match that really utilizes gear, and, you don't have to have the best gear to shoot the match, but I will tell you, your gear will be tested. your stamina as a shooter will be tested. There's some really intense stages that require mental preparation at the highest level, and it's also a unique match because of some of the props we get to use, and because we get to shoot from vehicles sometimes, and man, it is just a blast.
Yeah, so I totally agree. It's a kick in the pants. Last year, the 2017 match, there was, several stages where you're walking them, and you're like, okay, well, I have five shotgun targets off to the right, 4 off to the left. I'm going to go ahead and load 8, and then I'll shoot 4 more, and then I'm going to load 8. And so it became, for me, like drawing like a diagram of the forest, and including like all the targets and bushes, as well as putting in my load pattern in the middle here. And then, you get to the end, you're like, okay, then there's that, 100-yard full-size IPSC slug shot, or there's 100-yard full-size IPSC pistol shot, things like that. And you're like, okay, that's no big deal. And then it gets to like game day, right? And you're running through the forest there, all the scrub brush, you're dropping shotgun shells if you're me. You're hitting those loads, and you're shooting all that stuff down, and you get to the end, and it's just like, and now that easy 100-yard slug shot is not so easy.
Yeah, and when you're looking at a stage, a lot of times, at least the way that Jeremy designs them, I would walk through a stage and I'd be like, okay, this is going to be fast. I won't have to, stop too many times to, and plant my feet to shoot. I can shoot these shotgun targets on the move. And then you look up and there's, like you said, there's a 100-yard BC slug target, and it becomes a lot more start and stop movement than you thought it was going to be. The same being for some of the rifle targets. You can look at them and be like, yeah, I can kind of breeze past these and shoot them as I move. And you realize that it's not as easy as it looks, and some of the terrain can be kind of uneven, and it's a true test. And I think it's really cool because it's a match that I think everybody can make it through. It's not something it's not so physically challenging that it would be a detractor for people that don't want to have that high level of physical intensity at a match. They're not going to get turned off by it, but at the same time, you can push it really hard, and like you said, you can get to the end of a stage and be just gassed.
Yeah, it reminds me of obstacle racing, because you can walk an obstacle race and then do the obstacles, and or maybe not do the obstacles and just kind of move on down the line, and you can take your time as much as you want, or you can sprint between obstacles. You can crush the obstacles as fast as you can. You can finish, and you're going to be much more tired. So there are those different levels. But if you're looking for like unique shooting opportunities, Jeremy is one of the masters at that. Last year we had several props to deal with, and this year he's got a clean slate and going to do all new props and everything, new stages. But we actually shot from like the bodies of helicopters off of Connex boxes and things like that. It was a very, very creative use of the range. So one of the things I like to say, Reuben, is if I go and do like an event, I want it to be like something I can't do at home, right? So one of my biggest pet peeves is going to a concert and someone's lip syncing, because I could just put that CD on at home and enjoy it. But if you go to a match and there's things that you can normally set up on your own range, then it becomes kind of a bummer. And this is not that type of match. Like, there is so much stuff out there that you would not have the opportunity to shoot at your home range, that it's actually pretty cool. And on that note, it's also kind of intimidating trying to figure out how you're going to prepare yourself for that.
Yeah, this match is a match that when I actually, not to go down too big of a rabbit trail, but Jeremy Moore and I actually met in I believe it was 2012 or 2013. We were at a shotgun championship, Colorado Shotgun Championship.
Oh yeah.
And that's when we met in person. We'd emailed before that, but we'd started talking about that kind of shortly after, and Jeremy was like, there's a lot of matches, and people can go to matches all over the place, and if you're going to go to a match and spend money, and that just shows the character of Jeremy. I mean, he's a phenomenal person. He's also a really fun guy to hang out with. Yeah. But he's like, I want to make this I want to make this memorable, and I also want to make it something where people are going to come back because they feel like they got their money out of it. And I'm like, man,
Yeah.
that's so cool to know that the guy that's running the match that you're spending your money on has, that in the back of his head at all times when he's designing stages. And he said before, I thought this would be really cool, but it looked like it might have been one of those things where it would basically turn people off because it was too challenging. Even though I might think it's cool, a lot of people wouldn't. And that's cool because he's thinking of the competitor. And one of the other cool parts about this match, Dave, is that it's got a lot of long range rifle. And
Yeah.
coming from I'm working for a company that makes optics, and so a lot of the times when I'm out at the range, it's not always 3-gun. I've got several rifles that I can shoot PRS matches with. And I'm not a PRS competitor. I've shot several long range competitions, but that's not my main focus. Obviously, I'm focused mainly on 3-gun, multi-gun, and we've got other guys here at Vortex that'll go and compete in PRS and shoot the long range matches. But nonetheless, I still have the gear. It's super intriguing, and I love when I go to a 3-gun match and there's a lot of long range stuff. And Jeremy goes out of his way to make sure that there are plenty of long range challenging targets that will put the shooter to test.
Yeah, that's for sure. So last year, there was a stage that basically all the targets were set up in a V. We had like 2 shooting lanes, one out to the left, one out to the right. One went out to 505 yards, and one went out to like 605 yards, if my memory serves. And
I think it was about like that, yeah.
Yeah, and so you're shooting targets from 130 yards out to 600 yards and 130 yards out to 500 yards. And there were two shooting positions. Luckily, they were both prone because those are some challenging positions.
Yeah, it was a true shooting test,
yes.
Right? I mean, it wasn't, your heart rate wasn't crazy high. You weren't, overexerted from a lot of running. That stage in particular was a true shooting test.
Yeah, and it's all about like knowing your holds and stuff like that. So, well, last year I spent the winter in Texas, and I shot a lot of Dissonant Arms matches where in their club matches that, I think it's like $30-$40 to go out there and shoot in a one-day match. They're shooting out to like 450 yards on a regular basis. Here in Colorado, we're kind of limited on range, so I need help, Reuben. Like, what should I be doing to prepare for the Vortex Shooter Source match? And then let's bring this out to like the bigger topic of for the audience here of if you do have a match where there's a lot of long range coming up, how should you prepare your rifle and yourself for that match?
Well, I appreciate you asking that, and appreciate you bringing me on to talk about this, because in almost every area of 3-gun, people want to be challenged, right?
Yes.
When we're talking about, going to major matches, like the question always arises, like what matches truly challenge every aspect of the shooter? And I think where you can lose certain things is if a match is really heavily, bay focused. Nothing taking against bay matches, but if it's really heavily bay focused, you might lose out on some of the challenges with rifle. And so if we look at what people who aren't competitors think about guns, people who are still, they still own guns, they still go to the range a lot, they still shoot, we'll look at a pistol and we'll say, that's primarily intended for, use to whatever, X distance. And it's not absurd. They're not usually saying 100 yards, but in 3-gun, we still shoot pistols to 100 yards.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an absurd number, right? And we look at shotgun slugs, and, if you go to hard as hell, you're shooting a shotgun slug out to what's the buffalo or the bear? Is it 250 yards or something?
I want to say that bear was like 280 yards that one year we went.
Sure. But nonetheless, we're still pushing the distance, pushing the envelope on what's acceptable distance for that gun. On a rifle, I think most people would say, an AR-15 and 223 or 5.56 with the right loads is a capable platform to engage that 600-yard target.
Yes.
But it's also the one thing that I think a lot of people don't focus on enough, because you can really make up a lot of time at a match, or you can lose a lot of time at a match that is focused heavily on long distance. Like, I was just reading the round count that Jeremy sent out. I think it's preliminary. I think he's going to try to stick to it as much as possible. But there's 42 targets over 200 yards. Now,
it's a lot.
If you think about the last match that you went to, last major match, and there was 42 targets over 200 yards. Now think about the average number of shots that it took you to hit those targets, and be honest with yourself about how many makeup shots that you had for each target beyond 200 yards. I think most of us would probably think, man, I waste a lot of time by missing. So I know that I do, and that's what has kind of really pushed me to focus a lot on the long range aspect of rifle shooting, and within my 3-gun skill set, try and sharpen that tool as much as possible.
Yeah, it's a very good point. The when you think about for me, when I get down on the rifle in a position on the clock, I am worried about sending rounds downrange and like how long it takes me to get in there. But when you actually sit down and do the math, getting like that proper sight picture and sight alignment, which there is sight alignment with the scope, and being steady is worth the time it takes to do it, rather than miss and miss and miss.
Yeah, and a lot of that is when people get down into position, whether it be a VTAC barricade, whether it be a tank trap. It doesn't really matter what position you're getting into. It could be prone, it can be on an incline, decline, doesn't matter. Getting into position is one of the most important things, because your cheek rest is vital. Your position behind the scope, both horizontally, vertically, on all axes, is very important, because it's going to determine your eye relief. It's going to determine parallax, inducing parallax, which is a shifting of the image or a shifting of the point of impact based on your position behind the scope. There's a lot of things that are important. So a good example of that would be if you watch some of the guys that, like, one guy that I really look up to as a rifle shooter is Greg Jordan. Greg Jordan is one of those guys that when I watch him shoot long range rifle, it always blows me away, because he gets into position very efficiently. He gets behind the gun, and you're like, break the shot. Come on, break the first shot. Let's go. But what he's doing is he's taking time to get the proper sight alignment with, behind the scope, and making sure that each shot is a hit. And you might watch somebody like that, and they don't look like they're flying because they're not ripping shot after shot after shot. And it might take them an extra second to get into position. But on a stage that might take me 60 seconds to shoot, an all rifle stage, I get done and I'm like, wow, I did pretty good. I only had 3 or 4 makeup shots. And then I watch Greg Jordan shoot it, and he shoots it in 34 seconds and goes 1 for 1. I think he can be a really, really good example for anybody who's looking to be a good long range rifle shooter. And there's a lot of guys like that, not just Greg, but there's a lot of phenomenal rifle shooters in 3-gun. I think we can all learn more from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I've noticed in a lot of the major matches that are not exclusively bay matches, that the rifleman, so to speak, is at the top of the game, right? Lance Dingler said it on the podcast before, like the match is won and lost on the rifle, and he said it in context of the 3-Gun Nation shoot-offs, and if you stop and think about that axiom, the match is won and lost on the rifle, it spreads to every match, and it's not just a shoot-off when you're shooting the plate rack. Like it's a very important part of the game, and when you're talking long range, it becomes even more important.
Yeah, and it's not, to tell you the truth, Dave, it's not completely based on your shooting skill. It's not completely based on how much practice you get in. A lot of it is based on knowing your rifle, its capabilities, pairing it with the best ammunition that shoots out of that gun, because it's awesome to see shooters promoting their sponsors and promoting the company that, let's just take ammo for an example. someone can say, I shoot this ammo. It's the best ammo out there. It's the best long range rifle load. And a lot of times I've had it before where I've gone and thought, oh, well, if that person's endorsing it, I'm going to try it out. And I shoot it out of my rifle and it doesn't shoot very good or as good as something else does. And so you have to kind of be willing to be able to pair, rifles are a picky thing. You're they're a machined piece of metal that is, precision, either cut or buttoned rifling. And it doesn't always respond the same to, not every rifle is going to like the same ammo. And so a lot of times getting your rifle ready for the year, or, for the shooting season can mean a considerable amount of work. And one thing that I always kind of stress with people is there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that your long range rifle game, and let's just talk shots beyond 200 yards, right?
Right.
There's a lot that goes into that isn't practice, that isn't pulling the trigger. A lot of it is, sight alignment, proper trigger pull, having the right grip on, a lot of times we just use that for talking about pistols, but a lot of times you can carry that over to the rifle. Dry firing with rifle is important. But a lot of that prep work can go into knowing your rifle, knowing the data of the load that you're shooting, knowing what load shoots best, and then learning how to properly apply that into our world, into the 3-gun world, and how it helps us shave time off the clock. So I guess kind of with your permission, let's talk about what it looks like to get your rifle ready for a season in which you're going to have some matches with long range shooting.
Absolutely. Let me throw one little anecdote out there real quick. You talked about ammo. When I first started, I had just like an M4 style rifle, with the, hammer forged barrel, chrome line, stuff like that. And I just shot whatever 55 grain I could get my hands on at whatever time. And I noticed over time that not all 55 grain is the same. So the point of impact would shift if I was shooting American Eagle versus PMC, whatever was on sale that week, that I could buy. And then I noticed when I actually built my first dedicated 3-gun rifle based on all the knowledge that my wonderful guests have given me on the podcast here, I actually had a stainless precision barrel and legit trigger and stuff like that. And a good optic. The groups tightened on that 55 grain, mil spec ammo. So the platform means a lot. And then when I switched to precision ammo, the groups tightened even more to where they're touching. So the platform means a lot. The ammo means a lot. It's like an entire system all together. So yeah, let's talk about that system here. I'm going to be swapping to a new rifle coming up, so I want to talk about setting up the scope too. So let's not forget to put that one in there.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Dave. And I think when we go and look at, like you said, not all 55 grain FMJ shoots the same.
Yeah.
Not all 69 grain, Sierra Match King ammo shoots the same. Not all 75 grain Hornady shoots the same. And so sometimes it can require a little bit of homework on the back end, but you're really, really going to see it when you get out on the range and start shooting. And so for me, I think like a lot of people, and we've talked about this before, but I can't afford to shoot 75 grain ammo, even though it shoots the most accurately out of my rifle with a proof barrel that I'm running right now. I can't afford to shoot 75 grain for paper at 10 feet, right? It's just not realistic. And so a lot of us then are kind of forced to select a lighter load that might be lower recoiling, but not perform good at long distance or as good. And then we also select a long range load that, that does perform better in the wind and that does have, a higher ballistic coefficient, referring to the bullet's, efficiency of flight, right? Mm-hmm. And so for me, what I do is I'll go and pick a bunch of ammo up and look at it, and I'll take it to the range and do my normal zero procedure. I'll shoot it at 50 yards, and a lot of times what you'll see at 50 yards, it might be kind of hard to tell a major difference, but if we can stretch it out to 100 yards. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of my, the collection of ballistic data doesn't necessarily involve my 1-6 razor or 1-6 PST. A lot of the times I'll swap it out and I'll put a long range, higher magnification scope on so that I can be more precise and make a better decision. So for anybody out there that is kind of wondering, what's the benefit of that? Well, if I'm able to aim my rifle more precisely at 100 yards or 200 yards, I'm able to get better data out of that because I know that my shots were more well placed. A reticle that covers up 1/10 of an inch at 100 yards versus a reticle that covers up an inch at 100 yards, I'm able to be a lot more precise with that.
Yeah.
And so I'll go in and I'll take, a lighter load, like a 55 or a 60 grain load. Right now I've got a bunch of Hornady 62 grain. It's their black series of ammo. It's what my barrel likes the best right now for a lighter load, and it shoots really soft too. So that's kind of what I selected based off of what I had access to. And then I've got a longer range load, which is generally going to be a heavier bullet, anything from 68 or 69 grains all the way up to 77 grains. And I'll kind of see how those two play together, right? I'll zero it with one ammo and then I'll shoot the heavier ammo, and I'll see the relationship between the two. If the point of impact is very close at 100 yards, then that's actually really nice, because then all I have to do is make a very, very little changes in my ballistic software program, which we can talk about a little bit later too. But I'll test accuracy on all of them and then select the load that I feel is adequate and cost effective and all that other good stuff. And I'll say this, like, if you're going to be primarily shooting a lighter load, and your matches that you're shooting, if you're shooting mostly local matches versus mostly major matches, you may or may not select a load that performs to one set of standards or a second set of standards. So kind of what I'm getting into there is the load that I'm shooting for my light load, which is 62 grain, it performs phenomenally out to 300 yards, even in the wind. And so that gives me a little bit of flexibility. So I can realistically shoot a match without having to change ammo if there's nothing beyond 300 yards.
Yeah.
And then the same kind of goes for, I guess what I'm kind of getting at is that it's all going to be tailored to you as a shooter, and it's going to be tailored to the rifle that you're shooting. But once you found the loads that shoot well for you and that perform as expected, I think a lot of times when you're at a match talking to people and we're standing at a stage watching, people get ready and they're walking the stage and they're writing down distances. They got their rangefinder out. They're writing them down. And then they go into, a ballistic app like Straylock or Shooter or Applied Ballistics. Doesn't really matter what app you're using. Most of them generally will tend to use the same algorithms to determine ballistic drop or bullet drop. But when they're standing there, and they're saying, okay, here's my drop distance or my drop value for this distance, the next distance. And it's funny because sometimes you'll talk to people and you'll be like, man, that's crazy velocity. Like what, I'm curious about that level of velocity that you're getting, or maybe even just the smaller level of bullet drop that they're talking about. And they're like, well, that's what the box said for velocity. Oh, yeah. And that sometimes breaks my heart because those numbers are generally going to be calculated, unless it's a designed load for an AR-15, which is probably going to then be based off of a 16-inch barrel. It's probably tested, if it's a 223, it's probably tested on a 24-inch barrel.
Yes.
5.56 can be a little different, but 223 loads are generally going to be tested on a 24-inch barrel, which you can get significant increased velocity per inch, 40 to 60 feet per second per inch. So you could be looking at the box and it might say 3,240 feet per second, and then you go and you try it out and you chronograph it, and you might be 200 feet per second slower. I mean, that is completely realistic. That's not even, that wouldn't even surprise me if you were 200 feet per second off of what the box says. But here's kind of some funny data. I was shooting some ammo a couple of years ago when I was shooting a 14.5-inch barrel and went to Ironman. And this was actually one of the things that really got me into learning more about Ironman. Was one of the things that got me into learning a lot more about long range shooting. But the box of ammo that I was shooting was a 77 grain Sierra Match King. And the box said it was, I think, 2,880 feet per second. And my actual velocity out of a 14.5 was 2,550. So for anybody listening that doesn't quite understand what that means that my bullet is dropping a lot more than the box says it is.
Yes.
And so it becomes really important to chronograph, the load that you're shooting, and to have that built into a ballistic calculator so that you know exactly what your bullet is doing at long distance. And
I'll tell you that so I shoot that 13.5-inch Armalite, and I use 77 grain Nexus ammunition. I'm very fortunate that they're from the same parent company, because the 77 grain load was developed for the 18-inch and the 13.5-inch Armalite rifles.
Yeah, and that's fantastic ammo and fantastic rifles.
Yeah, for sure. And if you look at, so I'm looking at the velocity on the website here. It's 2620 is what they say it is, 2620 feet per second. And Jeremy Gresham told me at one time the length that they test out of, and I can't remember. I want to say it was 22-inch, but it could be a 24-inch as well. But I did chronograph this a week and a half ago out of my 13.5 with the chrono, 4 to 5 feet away. 2412 is what I got. So that's a 208 feet per second difference. And when you're talking 500 yards,
that's completely off the target.
It's huge.
You're hitting 5 feet in front of the target on the ground.
Exactly. So that is the importance of either buying a chrono or finding a good buddy with a chrono that you can do. And pro tip, a lot of ranges will actually have like an inventory of gunsmithing tools, and you can check out a chrono. So it's very, very important that you do that with your long range ammo. Yeah,
absolutely. And to that point, Dave, I mean, three gunners are incredibly generous people. I've actually, somebody helped me by letting me borrow their chrono to start. And I actually went and, a year later, I went and bought one, and I've borrowed it out to multiple people. But you're probably not going to use it a ton. So if it's something you can borrow from a local range or a local shooter, I don't want anybody to think you have to have a chronograph to shoot long range, but it really helps.
Yeah.
And if you can gather good data, it's vitally important to being able to hit consistently at 400, 500, 600 yards.
Yeah, and then to your point, paying it forward, if you do end up getting a chrono, let all your buddies know so they can get good data as well.
Yep. So when I'm gathering data, having almost a full afternoon at the range is something that you're going to want to dedicate to go out and figure out exactly the velocity that you're shooting. The bullet that you're shooting should be advertised on the box. If it's a 55 grain FMJ, just find out who the manufacturer of the bullet is. Most manufacturers are easily willing to tell you. And if they're not, take something very comparable and do it. But almost every long range load out there is going to be loaded with a bullet that has a good reputation, right? Like,
yeah.
Hornady is loading their BTHPs, the ballistic tip, or the boat tail hollow point, and they're loading their AMAXs, and other brands are either loading Hornady bullets or Sierra bullets, or they might be loading a bullet from Berger. And forgive me for there's tons of other good bullets out there, but generally you'll be able to easily find the ballistic information for that bullet that you're shooting. And enter that into a ballistic calculator. Now, I use a ballistic calculator called Shooter. It's called Shooter Ballistics, and that's a cool app because it's right on my Android phone. It allows me to have a bunch of different profiles for different guns. Straylock or iStraylock Pro You can use applied ballistics. These are all places for you to input that information and then ultimately access it when you need it. So I've got a bunch of my long range guns in there. I've got a bunch of work guns in there, but I probably have about 25 guns in shooter right now. And if I click on my 18-inch 223 wild chambered AR-15, I'm able to go in and look at the different loads that I have. So I have Freedom Munitions 55 grain. I have Hornady 62 grain. I have probably 8 or 9 different loads in there, but I've selected the ones that are shooting the best out of my rifle. And I go in, and the one thing that you're going to want to keep in mind is if you're shooting your 55 or 60 or 62 grain load, your light load, a lot of people will just say, your hoser load.
Yeah.
You're going to probably have 2 different point of impacts.
Yes.
And a lot of times one might be higher than the other might be lower than the other. It depends, but that is something that when you're entering it in to your shooter or to iStraylock Pro or whatever it might be, you can actually enter in your height at 0. So you can enter it in so that you're shooting whatever distance is, whatever amount high at a certain distance. Mm-hmm. And so your 0 distance might be 100 yards. You could then say that if your 75 grain ammo shot an inch higher at 100 yards than your 55 grain ammo did, you can actually enter that into your ballistic calculator and then use that data as you're shooting a long range stage, because you might have a stage where you have both close and far. And if it's, if there's 20 paper targets under 100 yards and then you get to a platform and you have to engage 5 or 6 long range targets from 400 to 600, we're probably going to make a mag change in between there. And then we're probably going to, start now with a different type of ammo. The ammo that would be optimized for those longer range targets.
Right.
And you're not going to have time on the clock to go and readjust your 0 on your rifle.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the thing. I think a lot of times people don't quite realize that, yeah, you can have a good ammo that performs really well at long range, and you can have an ammo that performs adequately at close range or adequately enough for shooting paper and steel under 100. But if they don't have the same point of impact, your data that you entered into your phone or into your ballistic calculator is going to be completely off.
Yeah. And I've only ever seen one guy dial on the clock, and that was Kim Lepinen. And he's just used to shooting IPSC type rifle competitions because he's from Finland. But the point of impact change, is one of those things you got to figure out in your stage plan where you're going to change your ammo, if you're going to change your ammo. And that depends on a lot of things. Like, distance is obviously the chief, but how big that target is as well is something that you can figure out. Like, for example, in the Texas 3-Gun Championship that I just shot a couple days ago, they had targets out to like 200. So you're like, okay, well, in one stage, for example, and you're like, okay, well, this may not be worth a 77 grain load, because that's going to cost me $1.25, $2.50, and as you go up, it's like, okay, well, this stage could get expensive. Maybe I'll use my 55 grain, and the targets are steel challenge targets, so they're large, right?
Yep.
So if you have something like that to deal with, you have to factor all that stuff in there. Like, okay, well, maybe my point of impact shift doesn't matter here, but if they throw like an 8-inch target out there, now your point of impact shift really matters.
Yeah, so a base stage with a 300-yard full-size IPSC steel at the end for a rifle target, and 20 paper targets under, whatever, at close range, mm-hmm. and you go, it might not be necessary to switch, because if your ammo is good enough for that target that you're engaging, then there's really no need to change. And so I would always encourage people to find out even what does your hoser load or your close range load do out at longer distances, because it might be good enough if the wind conditions are right on a stage that has targets out to 300, 350 yards, 400 yards even, and people will always, that's the exception. It's not the rule, but like if you can and don't have to change ammunition and stuff, it can be easily done. And somebody will say like, oh, I can hit 600 yards with 55 grain ammo all day, and that's fine, but that's not the point of the conversation.
Right. Well, and to that point, I was in a practice session a couple of weeks ago before I left for Texas with a friend of mine, and we're shooting 600-yard steel targets just for practice sake. And I'm sitting there with a half full mag of 55 grain, whatever I had at the time, and left in my box of Nexus was 7 rounds. So I stuffed the 7 rounds on top of that, threw it in there, and I'm trying to judge the wind because we had a lot of wind to deal with at various speeds down this thing, because we had flags at each 100 yards, or flags at 100 yards, all the way down to 600. And so you're watching like the different wind happening here, and you're trying to judge the wind and your hold and everything. And when I fired that last round at 77 and then fired around at 55, I saw for the first time a very visual representation of how the same wind reacts to two different bullets. And for me, in the wind that I was shooting at the time, it was a 3-foot difference, which is huge when you're when you're trying to hit something on the clock.
And I think that's fine, right? Like we have a thing that we say around here, and it's probably industry wide. It's probably not just us, but we always say trust the bullet, right? So
yeah,
it doesn't necessarily matter, because I know shooters that swear on shooting a 50 grain VMAX, just cranking out at super high velocity does just fine in the wind, and that's fine. But the reality is that most shooters don't do that, because that's going to be probably a hand loaded round, and a lot of people don't have the time to do that. So I will always say that if you have a load that you're shooting for long range and it isn't a 77 or a 68 grain bullet, that's fine. But that's the exception. That's not the rule. Most people are going to have two different loads that they're shooting, and they're going to have it one that's catered more towards long range and one that's close range. Like I've got several friends that will load a 45 or 50 grain bullet, and it's just smoking, super high velocity, and they swear up and down on it. Now, that same bullet doesn't carry as much energy at longer distances, and so that's where you can get into having trouble seeing impacts at long range. So that's the other thing, is we're shooting targets that are oftentimes reactive, and if it's an MGM swinger target that's activated, and there's a flag that has to be a flag that has to be visually seen by the RO to call the hit. And if your bullet doesn't have enough energy to move that enough, especially at long range, or we were shooting hard as hell a couple of years ago, and there was a target at longer distance, and it was a flasher target, and the wind was blowing so hard downrange that a lot of people's lighter loads weren't hitting that target hard enough to actually move it enough so that you could see the flag.
Yep.
So that's the other thing. It's not just about selecting the right projectiles and the right ammo that perform well in wind, or that are more consistent with their drop values. It's about having a load that has the right amount of energy to activate a target. So that also plays into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have been on the wrong side of that argument before, where like I know I could see through my scope that I hit that target, but it didn't move the flasher, because when you're dealing with targets at 400 yards and beyond, they want to give you the best opportunity to hit it. So sometimes you're looking at like a 16-inch plate hanging off of a flasher, right? And 16-inch steel doesn't move very much under 55 grains at 500 yards.
Right, so they're selecting a large target so that you have a higher likelihood of hitting it.
Yes.
But also you're hitting it with a very, very small projectile that at that distance doesn't have as much energy as it needs to really move it. And so then you go to relying on the RO seeing splash, frag coming off the target, hitting the ground below it and creating a little dust. A lot of times that can be misinterpreted for, they're just hitting low, and all of a sudden they're hitting the center of the target time after time after time. and they're just seeing the dust on the ground below the target from the frag coming off of, the impact. Magneto Speed has these new target hit indicators that are actually starting. Well, they're starting to hit the market now, but there are target hit indicators that that will have a strobe light, or they'll have a light that's moved off to the side, and that's a lot of times what we're seeing a lot of these matches going to for their long range stuff. Because if a competitor is hitting the target, there's always the argument of like, did you hit it, or did you hit it good enough to activate the flag? If I don't see the flag activate, or then I'm not going to call a hit. And it's like, well, I'm being asked as a competitor to hit the target. I'm not being asked to activate the flag.
Yeah.
And so that's one of those things where I have taken it upon myself to shoot a load that will always activate the target, and no matter what, so that I'm getting credit on the clock for what I'm doing.
And I gotta say, I'm loving those strobes, because there's no argument anymore. If I see that red flash, I'm moving on. If the RO sees the red flash, he's shouting hit. And in the early days of us trying these things out, we're gonna still have ROs on glass. So in case there is some sort of mechanical or electronic failure in one of those things, until we get used to them. But I think this is the future, and I'm pretty pumped that it's happening in a lot of big matches. Texas 3 Gun had them. I know Vortex Shooter Source is going to have them.
Yep.
It's pretty exciting.
I think that you'll see them become more and more popular in 3-gun matches. They're already really popular within PRS.
Yeah.
And actually, they were kind of initially developed for that ELR, the extreme long range shooting, where you're not going to see the impact with optics, or so you can see a red strobe flashing at 1.5 miles, but it's hard to see that impact on a spotting scope or on a pair of binoculars. And so that's where a lot of that came from. But it actually turns out that it really benefits competitors where time is of the essence. Mm-hmm. And as we know, that's what the sport that we play in is.
Yeah. Quick side note: the first time I saw one of those was at Generation 3 Gun, and it was on the stage that the Logan Bills at Tooth and Nail Armory built, and they always have long range targets. And I want to say that their it was like 373 yard target had it, and it was in this valley, and it was raining all weekend, and it was the last day, and there was no rain, but there was this like fog hanging there, and when someone would hit that target, the strobe would flash, and the entire valley would light up because of all the water in the air. It was just refracting off the whole thing. And it was creepy as hell. It was it looked like War of the Worlds, the old the Tom Cruise movie with like the red robots and stuff. I thought that was hilarious. It looked really cool. But yeah, I'm a big fan of those things. Well, all right. So I think we covered ammunition pretty well. We're gonna get that in a ballistics program to help us out with drop and things like that. Anything we want to cover more on ammunition before we move on to physical rifle setup?
No, I think we've kind of hammered that one. I guess to recap, pick what works best for you, and develop a plan ultimately for what you're going to be shooting, and that's the biggest thing is knowing, trust the bullet. Know where the bullet is going to be, and then you can select the right optics, the right mount, the right everything else to make it actually an effective combination with the other stuff that you use.
I got you.
And part of that is, this is going into the prep side of things, but definitely know, there's sometimes if you're using a BDC reticle, there can be different distances that you zero at. Work the numbers on a ballistic calculator. Once you get your velocity for if you're the type of shooter that only shoots one ammo, get your velocity, or two different types of ammo, or three. It doesn't really matter. Figure out what your velocity is for all of them. Get that put into a ballistic calculator with the proper ballistic coefficient, and then play with zero distances. So if you're shooting a BDC reticle, like a ballistic drop compensation reticle that's built for 223 5.56, I'll say this. Everybody says, oh, I'm shooting a BDC, so I don't have to know that. Well, that BDC reticle was based off of a specific load. It was based off of
Mm-hmm.
a certain type of ammo in a certain gun at a certain altitude on a certain day with a certain batch of powder and a certain lot of bullets. And
Correct me if
so,
I'm wrong, but a lot of them are built around like a military specification load, like M855, which is like a 62 grain steel core at sea level. Am I wrong on that?
no, I think you're absolutely right. And I don't know the history of BDC reticles. So please forgive me if I'm misspeaking, but I think a lot of kind of goes back to the ACOG having a very easy to use reticle, plug and play, drop it in, drop an ACOG on a 14.5 or 16-inch 5.56, and they're shooting green tip penetrator at sea level. That's, I think, where a lot of BDC, at least in the AR-15 world of AR optics, was probably kind of developed. And again, I could be totally wrong on that, but that's my first experiences with it.
That's my understanding as well. So we'll call that fact. We'll write that down. That's fact. No, I'm kidding.
Don't Google that.
So along those lines, I have found them to be inaccurate with shooting precision loads, BDC reticles. So I made a decision when I switched to shooting TAC ops to go with an MRAD reticle because it's like holding a metric ruler out in the distance.
Yeah, and the truth of it is, Dave, is that it's going to be different for everyone.
Right.
There might be a way that's more right than the other, but I don't think one is wrong and one is right, because really you're going to have the choice of a few different kinds of reticles. You're going to have a BDC reticle, you're going to have a mil scale reticle, or you're going to have an MOA scale reticle. Now, those MOA and mil are just two different systems of angular measurement that are used in multiple different worlds, but in the optics world, we know them as MOA and MRAD or mil. And yes, they are a scale. The BDC reticle is actually, I think a lot of people discredit BDC reticles because they were made for a certain load on a certain day. But if you so happen to be using something that performs very similarly to that, they actually can work really well.
Yeah.
And it requires a lot less work on the shooter's side of things, as long as you're using the equipment that it was intended to be used with. And as long as you know what your actual velocity is, you can match it up. And for example, if the BDC was off by a small amount, but it still gets you the hit on an 18-inch circle at 500 yards, then a lot of people will elect to shoot something like that with a BDC reticle simply because it takes less time on the back end to prepare for long-range shooting. Now, I, like yourself, have chosen to use a mil scale reticle or an MRAD reticle. You're shooting it in the 1:6 PST.
Yep.
I'm shooting it in the 1:6 Razor E this year. I also have a JM1 BDC that I have used a lot, depending upon the match, especially if I'm going to a match that has, specific berms for targets where due to range rules or safety rules, they have to put targets in front of a berm. And if those berms are at even distances, I'll actually cater what I shoot for that match based off of the target, presentations. But nonetheless, I'm using a mil scale reticle that we can then go into. We're not going to be, generally speaking, we're not going to be as restricted on the distance that we have to zero at with a mil scale reticle or an MOA scale reticle as someone who is shooting a BDC reticle would be, because we can go and do what works best for our rifle and our reticle or our optic, whereas people shooting BDC reticle are generally going to be stuck zeroing at a certain distance that reticle was intended to be zeroed at.
Right.
For me personally, I think a lot of times people say, well, it's an AR, so I'm just going to zero at 50 and I'll be zeroed at 200, and then I'm, hold top of target at 300. I think a lot of times that's a good way to get yourself kind of stuck in, I'm just going to do this right now because there's a very low percentage of long range targets and I'm not going to worry about those. I'm just going to be, I know where I am on close range and I'm not going to worry about it. Whereas if you actually go into a ballistic calculator, most of them you can import a reticle, a specific reticle from a specific manufacturer. We work with all these companies that make the apps to provide scale versions of the reticle so that when you're looking at your ballistic data, you can usually swipe over and see a picture of the actual reticle that you're using.
And that's one of my favorite parts about working with a ballistic calculator is I'm a very visual person. So if I can see what I'm supposed to see, then it makes it easier for me to do that on the clock.
Yep, and a lot of them you can actually select what target you're shooting at, and it'll show you what it looks like at different magnifications. And coming from the mental preparation side of things, it can be really nice because you can literally just look at it and you see what the target is supposed to look like and where you're supposed to hold based off of wind and all that stuff. And so I think that's one of those things that is probably really underutilized by shooters. And I'll say but it's only as good as the data you put into the app. So that's kind of where we go back to the preparation side of things.
Yeah.
It's vitally important that you have that. Even if you're off by 50, 60 feet per second, it can mean misses at long range.
Yeah, I tell you, one of the things that I had wrong last year that really screwed with me was scope height.
Oh, like height over bore?
Height over bore, yeah. So I totally made a dumb move, and I put the height over the flat top instead of the height over the bore into my ballistics calculator, and I had several problems where I would type it into Streetlock, and it would tell me where I'm supposed to hold, and then that would be way off from where I was actually seeing on paper at past 300 yards. And
sure.
I didn't find that out until like months later, and I was talking to a friend of mine that's a accomplished professional long range shooter, and by professional I mean like for the government, and he's like, oh yeah, there's your problem. And I was like, why didn't you mention that? He's like, well, I didn't think you'd be dumb enough to do that.
Yep. And so to anybody listening, your height over bore refers to, you have two bores. You have the bore of the scope, which is going to be the center of the tube diameter generally. So if you have a 30 millimeter tube, it's going to be right in the middle of that. And then to the center of the barrel. So a lot of times you can take a tape measure and just kind of center it on that horizontal gap in the scope ring. So you can kind of lock the tape measure into that gap as long as that gap is in the middle of the scope tube. And then you can hold it, if you lock your carrier back, you can kind of hold that tape measure over the center of your bolt. So you would ultimately want it to be where your firing pin is. And you take that distance, and that's also, that height over bore is a distance that you'll enter into a ballistic calculator, because your scope then, I mean, when it's mounted, generally 2.5 inches to 2 3/4 inches, depending upon the height of the mount you're using, you're dealing with things that are on two different planes. And so we need the ballistic calculator will need to take that into account when it's generating your data for drops.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Reuben. So while we're on the topic of scopes and height over bore and stuff like that, let's talk about setting up a scope. So if you've got a new scope, a new scope mount, or a new rifle, and you're putting those three things together, how do you do that? Because you were talking earlier about the about centering your eyeball in that scope box, looking for shadow around the ring. How do you make sure that in all the positions that we shoot in 3-gun, that you are seeing the crisp sight picture that you need to see?
Well, it kind of goes back to looking at the gear that you're using and determining that it is indeed the right gear for the match you're shooting. A lot of times you see people, they'll post pictures of, this is my 3-gun rifle for the year. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if we're being honest with each other, we oftentimes see people post a new rifle every year. And so whether that be new gear they get from the same sponsor, or whether that be, just buying something different to try out, or whether it be partnering up with a company that they hadn't partnered with before and using gear that they hadn't used before, regardless, a lot of the times you will see people that say, this is my 3-gun rifle for the year. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, there probably isn't a specific one rifle that is perfect for every match that we go to. So I will almost always look at the matches that I'm going to and what distances we're shooting to, the type of targets. Is it a bay match? Is it a terrain match? And then cater the gear towards that. So if I'm shooting my local match, which Adam Maxwell, Travis Vogel, and myself, along with the help of some fantastic other people, we set it up every month. We get a super good turnout, especially for being how close we are to Madison. We don't shoot past 100 yards at our match right now, just due to the range, due to the restrictions on distance and where we can shoot at the range, where we can run with guns per se. So my setup for that match might be completely different. Might have a stock that doesn't have an adjustable cheek piece. It might just be a basic carbine that's super light, because I'm not super concerned about getting into a prone position and shooting a 500-yard target at that match. Whereas if I'm going to Blue Ridge or Ironman or Shooter Source or Texas 3-Gun Championship, the gear that I'm going to select for those matches will be definitely gear that is acceptable for shooting at long range from different positions. So positional shooting at various distances. And so when you're looking at what height mount to use, oftentimes I think we're just going to set the standard here and we're going to say we're probably going to select a cantilever mount. It's a mount that was designed for use on the AR platform to give you proper eye relief and proper cheek height based off of the inline buffer system of an AR.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times you'll see kind of this movement towards a higher mount right now for guys that are shooting bay matches. That's so that you can, that would be at like a 1.93 inch height off of the top of the base, which add another about 1.5 to 2 inches based on the rifle that you're shooting. You're talking a significant height over bore on that mount, but it's allowing you to maintain upright and shoot in a natural, comfortable position without having to really tuck your head in. Now, the other thing that goes with that type of mount is you're probably going to have a higher cheek piece. So that is going to bring you into a stock with an adjustable cheek piece, like a Magpul PRS, or like an XLR, the stock that I shoot for most matches, but definitely matches that involve long range. I shoot the XLR. I believe it's the TacLite stock, and it has a user adjustable cheek height. Now you'll see guys shooting the TAC mod, the Cole TAC, the Luth AR. There's tons of different stocks, but ultimately your stock and your mount are going to determine how you interface with your rifle. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see guys that are shooting the old 3-Gun Nation style bay match, right? Or the UML style bay match where there's a lot of close targets. They're going to shoot something probably with a higher mount. It allows them to maintain that upright position and it doesn't restrict movement as much is really what it does. Versus if I'm going to a range with a match with a lot of long range, I might choose something that's actually a little closer to the bore. There's going to be less variation in my distance shooting based off of the height over bore. It doesn't affect it as much. And when I'm down behind that rifle in a prone position, I'm not uncomfortable. I'm not being pushed up that extra 1/2 of an inch.
Yeah.
By that higher mount. So generally you'll see 1.45 inches to 1.93. Those are kind of the standard heights that we're going to see on an AR. So it's important that when you're selecting what gear you're using, if you only have one setup and cater it towards the majority of the matches that you shoot. If you have a couple of different setups, which is ideal, then have one setup for one type of shooting and another setup for long range shooting. Again, that's ideal. That's not everybody can do that, but
right.
If we're being honest, we usually do see people that have multiple rifles they're running.
Yeah, that's for sure. Our buddy Adam is one of those people. He's got like a golf bag full of rifles for every occasion. But one of the first people that I saw that had that high riser and the high cheek piece was Andy Peterson. And this was a couple years ago when I took a class down at the TPC in Utah, and I was intrigued by that, and I kind of like the idea of having your head more upright when you're shooting. But now that you mention that, that was like right in the heat of the Three Gun Nation Pro Series. So
I think
obviously,
the first. Go ahead. Sorry.
oh, I was gonna say, so obviously his gun was set up for that, but us humans being, soft, squishy things, we can mold ourselves around, non-ideal situations. So putting your head down on a stock for the benefit of having that scope closer to the bore, seems like a good compromise.
Well, and just when you're in the prone position, which
Yeah.
oftentimes, let's think about when we're shooting long range targets. They might have you on a VTAC barricade. They might have you on a tank trap. It might have you shooting out of a helicopter if you come to Shooter Source, which it's cool, so do it. But if you're shooting prone, a lot of times having that extra height is going to be uncomfortable for you. So
Yeah.
it's for various reasons. The first time I saw someone using that height, that 1.93 inch mount, was Dan Horner. And again, that's the first time I saw it. I'm not saying that he's the first person to ever do it. Those mounts were actually developed for use with gas masks and for use with shooting over a PEC 15, which is, an IR designator on a rail mounted IR designator. And so while we in the competition world oftentimes like to think, oh yeah, we did that so that we could shoot Three Gun Nation Bay matches, it actually, it was developed for the military law enforcement application of shooting where you can't get your cheek down close enough on the gun.
Sure. And the other day I was watching Ryan Muckernern on a on a Vortex Live where he was talking about scope mount selection, and he recommended that you get the scope as close to the bore as possible, based on your body mechanics, your rifle setup, the scope itself, etc. And you just said that is to prevent variation in impact. Is that the idea?
Well, a lot of times we're talking about different guns, right? And so I think
Sure.
generally why we would try and get the scope as close to the bore as possible is so that oftentimes, I think if you looked at data, which isn't available publicly, but if you looked at data on what rifles are, sold most, like you're probably looking at like bolt action rifles, you're probably looking at Ruger Americans, Remington 700s. What I'm getting at is rifles without an adjustable cheek piece.
Right.
And since it's so important to have a solid cheek piece when you're shooting with a scope, so that you don't induce parallax and you don't induce scope shadow and all of that fun stuff, it is actually important to get your cheek on the stock. And what that usually means is mounting the scope as low as possible, taking things like bolt knob clearance and stuff like that into effect. But usually it's not necessarily because we're trying to avoid variations at long range. We can enter that into a ballistic calculator and that'll just tell us what it is. As long as we have the number, it doesn't matter. But usually it's for the comfort of the shooter, and it's so that we don't induce excess parallax into the equation.
Oh, okay. All right, so let's talk about parallax for a minute here. I know the term, but I don't know how I'm supposed to deal with that.
So parallax is just going to be a misalignment of one object to another. And oftentimes when you're changing your position behind a scope, you'll see parallax induced. And what that kind of explained, it's been explained this a million times, and you'll hear people all over the industry explain parallax like this. But honestly, one of the best ways to explain it is if two people were driving in a truck and the driver is sitting right behind the speedometer and the passenger is over in the passenger seat. The driver looks at the speedometer directly in line with the needle. That's telling you how fast you're going.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have, I don't know if this is the right term, but you have the subject, which would be the dashboard that has the numbers displayed on it. And then you have like an object, which is the needle moving as indicating your speed. And then you have your eye. If you move side to side, keeping the position of that needle constant, you can see that it will look like you're changing speed.
Yeah.
But then to explain that even better is to have now the passenger look over at the speedometer. He's going to see it displayed as a different number because of his position behind the speedometer. He's way off axis between the needle and the actual speedometer. And so he's going to see a different reading than the driver would. So perfect example, driver's going 55 miles an hour. Passenger looks over and says, why are we only going 50 miles an hour? And driver says, no, we're going 55 miles an hour.
That's a really good example. And my stepdad uses that all the time so he could speed without getting yelled at by my mom.
Oh, totally. It's actually a great idea. That's a very simple way to explain it. Now,
okay, I like it.
Now, if we look at kind of the application of that within a rifle scope, let's look at the subject as being the image that's being displayed within the rifle scope. Whatever your rifle is pointed at, the target, and then the speedometer is your reticle. And as you move side to side behind that, you can actually see the reticle move on the target. Like if you had the gun in a vise, and the gun wasn't moving, but you move behind the gun, you'll see the reticle move. And so when you mount the rifle scope, when you zero it, when you get all of that done, you want to make sure that you're consistent with where your head is, where your eye is lined up behind the scope. And so to ensure that you have that proper, alignment behind the scope, you're also going to take into account eye relief and making sure that you have your stock adjusted. If you have a permanently or in a fixed stock versus an adjustable stock, you would want to make sure that when you zero it, you have it set to how you're going to be shooting. So that's when you see people shooting at the zero range, they're sitting on a bench.
Yeah.
The gun's locked in. I will always zero the guns for, how they're intended to be shot. Try and get into the natural position that you're going to be in when you're shooting it, whether it be hunting, shooting a match, or just out at the range plinking.
Right.
You'll see most PRS shooters are zeroing their rifles from a prone position. You'll see, 3-gun competitors really should be checking a few different positions. You should always check how it would be mounted off of a barricade. You should check how it would be standing offhand and then prone too, and try and find that position, because most rifle scopes will have a little bit of leeway. They might say 4 inches of eye relief, but really it might be 3.5 to 4.5, depending upon what magnification you're at and depending upon how, what position you're in off axis on the scope. If you're not perfectly centered behind it, if you're perfectly centered behind the optic, you might actually have a little bit more eye relief. Okay,
so let's talk about that real quick. So, we've got an adjustable scope. We've got a mount we can move back and forth on, or forward and backward on the flat top, and then we have a scope that we can move forward and backward inside the scope mount, right?
Yep.
What if I'm starting from a clean slate? What do I set up first? And and then do I lie down and get my eye relief? Do I do it from reverse kneel? Do I do it from standing, or do I do all three? In what order do I do them in?
So that's a really great question. So the best way that I would explain this is most cantilever mounts will allow you to move the mount rather than just moving the optic. Mm-hmm. So generally what I would say, the way that I mount my rifle scopes on an AR-15 that I'm intending to shoot for action shooting is I'll actually mount the scope perfectly level using the leveling tools that I have. I'll mount it centered up so that aesthetically it looks right. So the scope isn't slid all the way forward in the mount or all the way backward in the mount. I don't want the turret housing or the eyepiece or the objective touching any part of the mount. Mm-hmm. I want those to not be in contact with the scope rings. And so what I'll generally do is I'll actually mount the scope, and then I put it on the rifle and I check at each different position. So what I would say is oftentimes standing upright, if you were thinking of yourself shooting a 50-yard plate rack, what would the position I would be in? Or if I was shooting paper at 25 yards, what position am I going to be in if I'm squared up to the target or on the move? Those are going to be generally the most forgiving positions, because you're upright. You can move your head forward easily. You can move your head backward easily.
Yeah.
You're going to be the least constricted that you will be in any shooting position. Now, then what you need to do is you need to figure out what position I have the least amount of flexibility with my body based off your body type, your height, or lack of height, like myself, and and ultimately figure out where do I have the least amount of flexibility? What position am I that I'm shooting in? Do I have the least amount of flexibility?
I'd probably be prone.
Prone is one of them, and some of the awkward positions off of barricades are also, going to be, they can be funky, but generally you'll see that prone is going to be the one where you would really want to make sure that when you set your rifle's eye relief, your scope's eye relief based on the position of the mount, forward or rear on the receiver, because a lot of times you'll have, plus or minus 5 slots that you can choose based off of mounts that most people use. So make sure that when you're prone, and make sure that when you're shooting off of these barricades, that you can get the right eye relief that you need, and ultimately make sure your if you have an adjustable cheek piece on your stock, make sure that's adjusted right. If it's like the stock I used, or the stock that I use is the XLR, that is adjustable with an Allen wrench. So I generally adjust that like before each match just to make sure that it's in position, but it's not just adjustable on the fly. So I would always make sure that if I've got prone positions that I'm shooting, that I have that set for that.
Okay, so start with prone. Keep the screws or the nuts loose. Check in reverse kneel. Maybe throw it on like a desk or a workbench or something like that, and then verify offhand, because you can move your head around offhand to compensate.
Yeah, I guess the one thing that I will reiterate is that there's not like a perfect position for everything, but if you select a rifle scope that's got adequate eye relief, there's a lot of them out there. Vortex has several options that have very good eye relief. There's other manufacturers out there too. There's a lot of good options is what I'm getting at, but select something that has forgiving eye relief. So what I mean by that is something that has an eye box, a scope that allows you to move around a little bit behind the scope and not induce scope shadow, because we are shooting out of awkward positions a lot. We are shooting on the move a lot. On a lot of stages, you're not necessarily worried too much about, how good your cheek rest is if you're shooting paper at 10 yards. But nonetheless, your eye relief of the scope is actually then really important, because you're not taking the appropriate amount of time to get set behind the gun. So
right.
All of that plays into getting your rifle set up properly, so that no matter what type of shooting you're doing, it's adequate or good. But again, oftentimes it's not going to be perfect for every situation.
I getcha. Okay, so I completely set up my scope backwards last time, based on what you just told me there. Because I put the mount down first, and then I left and I torqued it, and then I left the rings loose, and then I used a feeler gauge to make sure it was square, and then I moved it back and forth based on where I was at. But I started with kneeling because I could use it in a vise, and then I went to prone, and then I went to offhand. So next time I will know to do it the correct way.
And whatever, ultimately my way isn't the only way to do things. There's people that have been doing this a lot longer than I have that their way can be right too. But
sure.
I think ultimately make sure that in whatever order you do it in, just make sure that you have something that positions the scope properly for your least desirable position shooting.
I like that.
Or least optimal, I guess.
Least optimal, yeah. I like that. Now, what do you think about people becoming like romantic about how it's zeroed, how it's how the scope is set up and stuff like that? Do you recommend like changing zeros based on matches, or do you recommend finding something and then sticking with it?
There's something that romantic is kind of a funny term. Because you definitely do run into people that are like, no, 50/200 yard zero is the best. Oh, I have a rifle shooting background, so I only zero at 100 yards.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you need to be able to do is, I love the term rifleman. Like, I wish that more people were riflemen, riflewomen. But that, really, you see a lot of that in the IPSC rifle shooting. You see people that are just like, they're phenomenal rifle shooters. And Lainey Barnes is a phenomenal rifle shooter.
Yes, she's incredible.
She is. She puts us all to shame at times.
Mm-hmm.
And so honing that skill, just like we work on loading our shotgun in the basement, just like we work on dry firing our pistol, just like we work on every other aspect of 3-gun, I think it's important for people to focus also then on making sure that you're a rifle shooter. And it's something that can really pick up. You can really make up a lot of time and stuff at a big match, and build confidence on long range matches. And I think that a lot of people do avoid the matches that are heavy long range because they're afraid of, well, that looks like a fun match, but I don't, I'm not a skilled long range shooter. And it might not be necessarily to the shooter. It might be because you don't have a lot of long range opportunities at your local range. It might be because you don't have a local range that has long range opportunities. It's not always your decision, but if you have it available to you, it is a great skill. Now, going back to kind of the question of, is there, I guess, how did you phrase the question? Was it like people getting romantic about a certain perfect one size fits all?
Yeah, exactly. Or do you tailor it to the match you're going to shoot?
Well, I think that if we're looking at every other aspect of our game, we pretty much tailor it to the match.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like rifle is this given thing. No, I'm not going to change that because that's what I use. I only use a 50/200 yard zero. But what if there's a 100 yard plate rack? Like, perfect example, 100 yard plate rack. If you use a 50 yard zero or 200 yard zero, you're going to be between 1.5 inches and 2 inches high at 100 yards.
Yep.
So that takes my margin of error, and it allows me to miss the target even when the reticle was on the target, if I'm close enough to a top edge. And so then now you have to think about, okay, what distance am I zeroed at for that target? I better hold low on the plate. Adrenaline's pumping, you get through a stage and you find yourself missing the same plate time and time again. And you're like, oh shoot, it's because I'm zeroed 1.5 inches to 2 inches off of that target. Yep. On a 6-inch plate. You just lost. Literally, you could lose a third of your actual target presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think you do have to be able to be flexible and be able to tailor it towards the match you're shooting. And I know how scope works internally. I probably have a little bit more access to that than the average person, but that's something I'm very fortunate with my job. And I trust the gear that I use. And so when I go to a match, oftentimes if I am running a 200 yard zero on my rifle, and there is something like a 100 yard plate rack or targets that are smaller, I'll just go into my scope, make the adjustment before the stage, and go back in after that stage and make the adjustment again. But I trust the gear that I use, based off of past experiences with this gear, to know that I don't have to go to the zero range every time I make an adjustment. Because if I followed proper mounting instructions and proper mounting procedures when I did it, and if I go to the range a couple times and test it out just to see if when I make an adjustment, if it actually comes out in the scope, I'll trust my gear enough to know that if I have to make a 1 to 2 inch adjustment at 100 yards, and then after that stage is done, go back and adjust it to where I was before, I trust the gear enough to do that. And so I think that to be an effective rifle shooter or rifleman, I think it is important to know your gear a little bit better than the average person does.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I think that's awesome. And one thing that I would add to that, Reuben, is that, a lot of the places that we go to shoot, if there are bays, they'll have those bays set up for the match, right? They'll have stages in them. And
Yep.
usually they'll have the least desirable bay for a 0, right? So I would say that you need to know where your rifle impacts at 25 yards and 50 yards, because a lot of times 25 and 50 are the only 0 ranges available. And a lot of people that travel via plane, you may not get your rifle case or your gun case treated with the same care that you would give it.
Yep,
and
totally.
A lot of people will re-zero when they get to the range. So if you have like a 100-yard 0 or 200-yard 0, know where it impacts at 25 and 50, and have that data available like in your notebook or something like that, so you can adjust when you get to the range. And the other thing I would say is that a 50/200-yard 0 is a myth. And
Yeah,
that
totally.
that is based on one load, and it is not the case with the load I shoot, which is Nexus 77 grain ammo out of a 13.5-inch Armalite. That is not the case. It's more like 50 186 or something, and that 15 yards is an important.
It can mean a couple inches for sure.
Yes, yeah, it's an important distinction for me.
That's one of those things that we throw it around as a term a lot, because it's definitely something that people would refer to when we're talking with customers. Like generally speaking, you're going to be very close at those distances. But no, I agree with you. It's definitely not a given for everyone.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, and it's something that I think is like doctrine that's thrown out there. Like I definitely watched it in a Travis Haley video, and I was like, oh, okay, well, this must be the deal. And it was pretty close when I was shooting limited, because I was shooting like a 4 MOA red dot, with a flare on it and stuff. So realistically, how close can you get? But once I started shooting TAC Ops, where you can actually have some zoom on it, I realized that is not the case whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what this whole discussion has been about, is definitely knowing your gear rather than just trusting what the box of ammo says, or trusting what somebody at a range says about zeroing an AR-15 or whether it be for hunting, competitive shooting. It doesn't really matter. Like, you'll hear a lot of misconceptions about where to zero, what distance to zero. This ammo always performs better at long range than this ammo. This is the best thing to do if you're going to shoot long range. This is not the best thing to do. And I think what it boils down to is you have to know your gear, and it does equate to time at the range. It definitely isn't the sexy look how fast I can shoot video for Instagram. It does actually require a considerable amount of attention, and you have to make sure that when you're gathering data for your rifle, whether for 3-gun, hunting, just general plinking, or self-defense, it's only as good as the data you put into it. So, what you get out is only as good as what you put in.
Awesome, Reuben. I love that. It's a great place to wrap up here. That's a good final thought. Anything else you want to throw out there to make sure the folks know before we sign off here?
No, I think that we covered a lot of good stuff, and what it boils down to ultimately, Dave, is there's a community within 3-Gun that is definitely willing to help out anybody who has questions about zeroing a rifle scope, selecting a rifle scope, getting data for the loads you're shooting. You can definitely reach out to me. My contact info Dave has, so anybody who's listening can hit me up directly. I'd be happy to help anybody. Otherwise, a lot of times you can really tell who within the shooting world is doing their homework, because they're usually the guy that's going 1-for-1 on the long range targets. So that's probably a good guy to ask too.
Absolutely. And one of the cool things, so this plug for Vortex here, you guys have like a very good customer care line that I've actually used a couple times, and I don't call up and like, hey, this is Dave from the 3-Gun Show. I just say, hey, is there someone that knows what I need to know? And either that person that I get has a working knowledge of that, or they'll transfer me to someone who does, which is cool, because you guys have competitive shooters, hunters, long range shooters, etc. over there. So if you have a question, Vortex customer care is a good place to start. Hit Reuben up, hit me up, whatever it is. And Reuben, man, I'm looking forward to seeing you in a couple weeks at the Vortex Shooter Source.
Well, I'm actually headed to the range today to do all of what we just talked about doing, so that I'm not a dirty, terrible hypocrite. So the rest of my afternoon will be spent on the range, verifying all of my data and ultimately setting up some longer range targets to make sure that I know what's happening on my calculator is actually happening on the field. So
very nice.
Anyone that has any questions, definitely hit me up. I'd be happy to help. If you have questions on, shooting, how this applies to shooting a limited gun. I mean, Adam Maxwell works here at Vortex 2. He's a very knowledgeable guy. If you have questions on how it applies to a hunting rifle, Ryan Muckenher is one of the most knowledgeable people I know. And so I think, kind of to play off of what you said, Dave, we're happy to be a resource for shooters, hunters, really anybody that has questions about how to get this done. And if I don't know, I will direct you to somebody who does. We have guys that, Scott Parks is a very, very high-ranked PRS competitor. I won't even pretend to know how that all works, but he's a guy that can go and do well at PRS matches. So you can ask him too. Very
cool. And one last thought before we go here. Vortex Shooter Source is coming up. It's in Crescent, Texas, which is outside of Fort Worth. There are slots open as we record this, so if you're interested, I'll put a link in the show notes, and it's always on Practice Score. And come out and shoot with us and see how we match up.
Yeah, definitely check us out. I believe the Instagram is VS3G, so it's going to be, there's a link to the website on there as well, and Dave will put one in the show notes.
Absolutely. Well, Reuben, thanks for your time, man. I appreciate you taking the time to teach us a lesson about preparing for long range shooting in 3-gun right before you're going to go out and do it yourself.
Anytime, Dave. I'm super, super fortunate to call you a friend and to have been on the show a couple times now. So thanks again for having me, and we'll chat with you soon.
All right. Thanks, buddy. Hey, before you take off, check out the show notes at 3gunshow.com for links to things that we discussed in the podcast. You can also sign up on Patreon as a 3-Gun Show supporter or purchase 3-Gun Show apparel. This podcast is brought to you by Breda USA, Italian shotguns that are the best in the world. And this is a shotgun tech tip from Team Breda. Hey, this is Dave Hartman from the 3-Gun Show, and I've got Josh Tanner here with Team Breda, and we've got a shotgun tech tip for you. Josh, what do you got?
All right, today we're going to talk about point of aim, point of impact change on a shotgun when you run a lot of rounds down through the gun. So on a long shotgun stage where you've shot a lot of birdshot, the barrel will heat at a different rate than the ribs do, which can start to affect the point of aim, point of impact versus a cold gun. Now, I found that to be much less of an issue with these Breda shotguns, I think due to their barrel manufacturing process, but it's still important to go out and warm your shotgun up really, really hot, shoot a lot of rounds through it, and check and see what that point of aim, point of impact is different with a warm gun versus a cold gun.
All right, thanks, Josh. That's your shotgun tech tip from Breda Shotguns. Check out Breda's B12i 3-gun ready inertia-driven shotgun at BredaUSA.com. That's BREDA. Quick reminder that if you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, subscribe in iTunes, Google Play, Podcast Addict, or wherever you get your podcast content, so you will always get the very latest. Thank you so much for downloading, listening, and subscribing to the show. I'm Dave Hartman, and I'll see you on the range.
If you are finished, unload, show clear.